Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. It's a little bit sure. Good day to everyone who had joined us. This is IPRI's last side event for 15th session of MRIP. For those who had joined us for the other two events on Tuesday and Wednesday, thank you very much. And for those who are here now, I hope you're all doing okay wherever you are currently watching us. So for this side event, the Indigenous Peoples Understanding and Underlying Issues and Challenges in Documentation is organized in partnership with the New School, which we'll learn about more later. So we'll be presenting research that the graduate students from the New School has worked on, initial research on incarceration of Indigenous peoples, and we'll also hear their reflections and insights in doing the research on Indigenous issues and rights within the context of incarceration. And of course, hoping that this side event will also strike an interest for more younger researchers or young researchers to work on Indigenous issues and rights, maybe in partnership with Indigenous organizations such as IPRI. So without any further ado, let me welcome our first speaker to provide us with our welcome remarks and an overview of the partnership with the New School. So Sandra Kremer. Sandra Kremer is the chairperson of IPRI's Global Board of Directors. She's a Wani Kalkadung Indigenous woman from Australia. She is the CEO of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Alliance, a lawyer and adjunct professor in public health at the University of Queensland. And she was awarded a member of the Order of Australia on Queen's Day, Queen's birthday on 2019 for her work on Indigenous peoples, particularly in women. And it is through Sandra's efforts that made this partnership with the New School possible. So Sandra, please, you're on the floor.
Thank you. I welcome you all here today as the chair of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International, and I acknowledge all the lands and territories you are on. The Indigenous Peoples Rights International works to protect Indigenous peoples' rights, and we call for justice to victims of criminalizations and impunity. This event is being held jointly with the New School in New York, as Joyce had said. For IPRI, we are aware of the high incarceration rates and the unfair process by the legal and justice system towards Indigenous people, especially land defenders. There is very little truth-telling evidence-based data, and IPRI is working together to build evidence base regarding Indigenous victims of criminalizations around the world. I'd like to thank Professor Mark Johnson, and particularly the students from the New School who have started the process to help us gather and write the report to provide IPRI with evidence of the violations of Indigenous peoples in Tanzania, Indonesia, Canada, USA, and Guatemala. I'd also like to remind everyone that for us as Indigenous people, even though we're the most researched people in the world, this was not easy because there is not a lot of reports or data on this topic. But the students dug deep and they put together a great report so that we at IPRI can build on. Each speaker will introduce themselves, and I welcome Mark Johnson as the first speaker. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark, for this. And I'd really like to thank you for being in partnership. This is, I think, about the 5th year that we've been working together in doing and working with Indigenous communities and organisations around the world to be able to do research with them so that we as a collective voice can make sure there's truth-telling in the work that we do and in the researches that we do together. So thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, Sandra. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be invited and to participate in this. Joyce, can you share my presentation, please? I just have a few slides which I think will outline our project and our work.
Yeah. Ivan, do you have that on your file? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you can go on to move to the second. So As Sandra introduced me, I'm Mark Johnson. I teach in the Graduate International Affairs program at the New School University in New York City. I teach monitoring and evaluation, project cycle management, and worst and better practices international aid and development. I also bring students to Ethiopia during the summer to work on what's known as our International Field Program, which is meant to give our students real practical field experience. And I also supervise our capstone practicum projects, of which our collaboration with IPRI was one. And I'm a professor of practice, and I think it's really important for our students to work directly with these clients like IPRI. I think that's a really important part of our program. Working with clients on your projects, not our projects, so that we get a sense of the type of work that such important organizations as IPRI are doing. Next slide, please. And as I said, I'm a professor of practice, so I work with clients in the field currently in Ethiopia, Kenya, Burundi, Guatemala, and the United States. I'm in Ethiopia right now working with a consortium of women's microenterprise organizations. I've been working with this group for about 10 years, so I have ongoing research with them. Next slide, please. So, Sandra, you mentioned that we've been working together for about 5 years. As I believe that 2016 was our first project collaboration, where we had a team that produced advocacy packet and also produce a grant proposal. Next. And this current work, which I'm not going to say much about because the students are going to get much more deeply into, was over the course of 2 semesters as their capstone practicum project, studying the incarceration or over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples and the issues behind that in 5 countries: the United States, Canada, Guatemala, Indonesia, and Tanzania. Next. So most of their work obviously was research, and Sandra mentioned how difficult it is doing this research, and I would concur with that. I was really surprised because, we get used to feeling like we can Google anything and there's going to be just abundant research, but I think that our students will concur on that. A lot of the research that we were trying to do just isn't there, which I think really made us feel like this work is really important to do, and was also a revelation on the lack of data. We were often looking for very specific quantitative data on incarceration rates, and we just couldn't find it, which I think, we're used to being able to find, I think, in 2022, whatever information we want, we feel like it's going to be available. And I think what we saw was that a lot of it is not available. Throughout the 2 semesters, Sandra also spoke of that we're going to be doing interviews, but we have to recognize also how difficult that can be because people are afraid to talk. And I think we also really saw that difficult getting people, even by email, to answer questions because they're rightfully afraid of any consequences behind that. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm also working with a group in Guatemala. We have a project in an indigenous highland community. And while I was there, I was also looking for contacts for this project. And I really found that people just did not want to talk about it. Okay, next, please, Joyce. So I think that for our program, we're a Graduate International Affairs program. I think it's really important that we have this collaboration and that this collaboration continues, because I feel like if we're an international affairs program and we're thinking about the issues that the world is facing, I'm sure everyone will agree that the Indigenous communities are really at the forefront of those issues, including racism, human rights, climate change. And, you know, one real theme that we saw in all 5 countries was land grabs by corporations and governments, and then the counterpoint to that with the Indigenous communities and the land defense. Next, please. So moving forward, I think we need this collaboration from our end, and it's been a popular collaboration. We present a lot of options for capstone practicums, and students have always chosen this project to work on. So I'm looking forward to continued collaboration. And moving forward, I think what I felt was that I don't really have the background to properly supervise this project, honestly. My own research is really more in economic development. So we really need the input and real involvement from IPRI. Sandra's been great, but is so busy that, you know, I feel like I have needed a lot of help in this. So I think moving forward, I would ask for even more involvement from IPRI if that's possible. Though I know everybody is so busy that that's difficult, but that would be, I think, my main suggestion moving forward. Next, although that might be the last slide, and if it is, then I'm looking forward to also hearing again our students present their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for providing us also your thoughts and highlighting the need for in doing research, field work, and because not everything is online, and then like an actual interaction and doing work on the ground is still very significant, even despite this age of technology with social media and Google search. And for the recommendations, that's definitely duly noted. So for the first speaker with the students to present her initial research on the US is Molly Simpson. Molly holds an undergraduate degree in geography from the University of Oxford and recently graduated with an MA International Affairs at the New School. She has interned with IPRI since 2021, working on the incarceration of Indigenous peoples in the US. She now works as a policy analyst and officer for London councils. So Molly, please.
Yeah, sure. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. So as was mentioned, I'm Molly. I'm a recent graduate from the New School, and I spent about 7 months interning with IPRI, exploring incarceration rates of Native Americans in the United States. And today I'm going to give you a short overview of my paper and its findings. So without further ado, so this was loosely how my paper was structured, and therefore I thought it was the most logical way of talking through it, laying out the background, outlining the measures available to Native American communities, and then discussing my conclusions and recommendations off the back of these. But ultimately, the primary aim of this paper was simply to shed more light on the issue of Indigenous incarceration, because while I knew there was overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the US prison system, actually finding the data to support this was markedly more difficult than I had anticipated. So just as a short introduction into the matter at hand, Native Americans are very much the unseen victims of an unjust criminal system. And as it says here, they experience one of the highest rates of incarceration in the nation. I believe they're actually the biggest group per capita behind 18 to 25-year-old African American males. And this is most apparent across states, particularly states with high proportions of Indigenous peoples, namely South Dakota and Montana, where rates of Native Americans in prison is markedly higher, being almost half of the prison population in South Dakota and 1/5 in Montana. This issue is particularly acute across Native women and Native youth. For example, while Native men are imprisoned at 4 times the rate of white men, this actually shoots up to 6 times the rate for Native women against white women. In regards to Native youth, they are also quite grossly overrepresented in the juvenile detention system. They account for between 13 to 19% of the prison population, even though they're only less than 2% of the national population. And in particular, they find themselves incarcerated for what's known as status offences. These are effectively actions that are only deemed illegal because of age. A good example is violating liquor laws or skipping school. And while this is quite understudied, it's generally believed that Native American youth who are charged with these status offences are caught out for the disproportionate rates of stop and searches that they encounter. There's also the very pressing issue of Indigenous land and water protectors being incarcerated as a result of their activities in demonstrations, usually, as Mark alluded to, in response to state and or corporate bodies trying to exploit native land by installing oil pipelines or some other extractive activities. It's worth noting that the US has broken pretty much every treaty that they've made with Indigenous nations in the United States, meaning that they usually are trespassing on land upon which they have no rights to. Nevertheless, when Native Americans seek to protect their own land, they're often met with violence and subsequent incarceration. To make matters worse, outside of state and federal incarceration systems, you also have tribal correction facilities, and these are overseen by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is actually a very largely neglected aspect of the prison system within the United States. Native peoples of a given area will have judicial autonomy over these lands, which in theory, of course, is a very good thing. However, the agency is chronically underfunded, and a very good example of this is that they don't even have a correctional healthcare budget, which of course compromises the health of their inmates. You also have reservation jails and prisons being deeply overcrowded, so with around 11% of inmates within these jails and prisons being double bunked in single occupancy cells. Again, exacerbating the issues identified is that there's a real lack of recognition of where tribal authorities have autonomy. Not only does this weaken the Native people's right to justice, but it also does much to erode tribal sovereignty. For example, Indigenous peoples are frequently prosecuted under federal law for serious offences committed on reservations, while state punishments for that very same crime actually tend to be lighter. There are some measures in place to improve Native American access to justice and also to improve judicial capabilities within reservations. For example, the Tribal Law and Order Act, which was signed into effect in 2010 under the Obama administration, is considered a major step towards improving Native autonomy across reservations. And it also necessitates the enhancement of data collection, which, as we've all kind of spoken to varying degrees, is very, very necessary because it's lacking at the moment. The Tribal Issues Advisory Group is also a really great initiative, and it works to offer more just and equitable revisions to sentencing guidelines relating to Indigenous defendants and victims, in addition to offences that are committed on reservations. However, it's obviously worth noting that the measures identified are plagued with an all too familiar issue. They're deeply underfunded and deeply under-resourced. The reality is that Native American defendants remain in a relatively weak position when facing court, which obviously only ramps up incarceration numbers. A big issue that I encountered while undertaking, as did all the other students, was that there actually wasn't much data publicly available to analyse. And where there was data, its quality was at best questionable. For example, multiple states with high Native American populations will still delineate Indigenous peoples within the other category, which of course obscures and undercounts true numbers. Moreover, on Indigenous reservations, reporting on prison statistics is only voluntary, and so not all groups report crime statistics onto the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Database, which is a really key database for incarceration statistics. So as a result, truly comprehending the effect of mass incarceration on Indigenous communities becomes a very naturally difficult task with such scarce data available. So on to my concluding points and recommendations off kind of the back of my paper. Native Americans are very much the victims of the US justice system, which is innately broken. But this matter is largely overlooked. As is commonly the case, it's women and Native youth who feel the effects of this injustice most acutely. And presently, the measures in place to address the issues I've identified are very much underfunded and under-resourced. So with this in mind, I've drawn up a couple of recommendations to begin to remedy this issue that are relevant for policymakers and NGOs alike. So the first one is increased funding. So funding is the first step towards improving conditions for Native Americans incarcerated on reservations. We must lobby for federal and/or state powers to heighten their funding to the Bureau of Indian Affairs to ensure that these prisoners are claiming their basic human rights. Next up is communication. There needs to be a clear and transparent network amongst those who tend to exercise jurisdiction, because currently there is very little amongst those stakeholders. Next up is comprehensive data. It is very hard to petition for more just and equitable conditions when the data we're using is at best patchy. So this really needs to be worked on. And finally, addressing the core issues. Native Americans are systemically discriminated against in nearly every aspect of their life, which only heightens their propensity to incarceration. This must be addressed and targeted. So that's a brief sight into the work I've completed with Indigenous Peoples Rights International. I hope you found it interesting, and unfortunately I'm unable to stay for the panel afterwards, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have. And if you don't have any now, but think of some later, my email is at the bottom, and I believe these slides will be made publicly available. So thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Molly, for sharing your research, and we could see the work that you've put into to provide this research. And thank you, even if you're working, for making yourself available and joining us now. For those of you who has any questions for Molly before she leaves, please feel free to write them in the chat box or in our Q&A response. And if you could direct your question, like your question from Ashok, is that directly from Molly or is that in general? But maybe just to put also like what you mentioned, and I think that's also what one of the things that IPRI has been reflecting on in trying to really work on an evidence-based and establishing databases on cases. The importance of having a data that we can that is made available for further studying, and aside from the work that we generally do, which is advocacy. And also, it's I just wanted to highlight that good that you have also put an emphasis on the impact of youth and women, or incarceration of Indigenous youth and women, and the issue on the tribal authority or the lack of it within the overall U.S. Governance. And of course, it is indeed important that we highlight the underlying issue of discrimination, which is what's prevalent in all of this. Their reason for being incarcerated or attacked or criminalized in that sense. So this is a general question that is being asked. What are the protection of Indigenous rights, especially sovereignty and identity? I think those are the ones that you mentioned. Do you mind mentioning them again, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you can hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I think the main issue, the main issue that we have is ultimately, I think there is legislation in place. I think the UN obviously has the kind of expert mechanism on Indigenous people's rights, and there is some form of so the US has a similar kind of mechanism. It's kind of almost followed verbatim the kind of UN Declaration to Indigenous Rights. However, at the moment, it has done very little to kind of go beyond a piece of paper. And I think what we really need to see is some systemic change, so some de facto change. At the moment, you know, we've seen kind of papers that identify that changes, like there should be change happening, but we haven't actually kind of seen that in practice. In the case of the US, most reservations do have some kind of legal form of sovereignty over their land and autonomy. However, as I say, throughout history, the US has broken literally, there's been about 370 treaties, and the US has broken every single one, which is obviously a grave, grave issue. And I think the biggest thing we have to address, and this kind of goes beyond incarceration, this just goes speaks towards Indigenous rights in general. They need to be acknowledged as kind of a basic legitimate form of human rights. And at the moment, I don't think that is the case, particularly in the United States. The United States government kind of have stripped Indigenous peoples of their history, and it's a grave kind of crime. But we need to recognize Indigenous rights. That's what I mean when I say about addressing the core issues. I think there are so many other things that will be resolved later along the line if we first and foremost just address kind of Indigenous rights as human rights. And as I say, I don't think that's particularly a matter that's being addressed at the moment.
Just before Molly leaves, Sandra and Mark, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much, Molly, for that presentation and the time that you've taken out to do that. And I really enjoyed working with you, and I know that you've taken that. One of the other things that we were discussing in this report, and I do know that you have to go quickly, is about the women over there and what happens with them when they're on their reservations and the different laws that have applied for women on reservations. Because what happens is that, and it's now, you know, there are changes happening and towards that, but what happens is that because of the tribal laws and the tribal courts, they deal with the issues on those tribal lands, and people need to understand that. So when it comes to the colonizations or the US law, sometimes they're not implemented against white people when they commit a crime on a Indian reservation. And that was one of the biggest issues, I think, is that them not able to, you know, seeing white people commit a horrific crime against Indigenous women and still not be charged. And, you know, they could walk away free. And I think that's one of the downfalls when we've been doing this research, Molly and I, and looking at that. But thank you again. Thank you very much, Molly, for this.
No, not at all. Actually, just feeding off the back of that, earlier this year, there was the reauthorization of, I think it's called like the Violence Against Women Act.
Yes.
And what it's supposed to do is reinforce tribal jurisdiction and enable kind of tribal authorities to persecute non-native perpetrators who are accountable to a crime. However, again, and this is the same with a lot of things, on paper that's, and in theory that's an excellent idea, but it's actually very rarely allowed to be executed. And yeah, basically on paper, I think we have enough to really kind of enhance, at least in the United States, tribal autonomy, Native American autonomy and sovereignty. However, I just don't think we're doing enough to actually put that into practice and fulfill it. But yeah, that's a good example is the Violence Against Women Act, because it's there, but we're just not doing anything about it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Molly.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks also for joining us. And I think it's the same as mentioned from our participants here. It's the same in Bangladesh and India and other parts of the world. The lack of implementation, if there are these protective measures, legal protective measures, even if they exist, sometimes implementation is problematic. Thank you very much. I don't see Khadija supposed to present Guatemala and Canada. So let me just, I hope Lucas, you're ready. Lucas Giosa is also one of the students from the new school. Lucas served with the United States Peace Corps as a health outreach specialist in Mozambique from 2017 to 2019, working with rural coal and gold miners who were in search of information concerning malaria and HIV. That inspired him to further his experience working in development and empowerment by applying to the New School Graduate Program for International Affairs. With his master's degree and experience, he intends to collaborate with those who seek to bring a strong and truthful voice to the stories that are so often unheard by the world at large. Lucas will be presenting his initial research on Tanzania. So Lucas, please, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, wherever you are in the world. I should also mention I'm here in Cuba right now studying the community public health system. So my internet might be a little bit spotty, and so please forgive me. On Tanzania, just jumping right in, my initial research yielded some of these key points that I have written down here. That indigenousness is a recent concept adopted by four tribes in Tanzania. And we have to remember too that there's about 125 to 130 different ethnic groups, four of which have, as I said, adopted the concept of indigenous for in search of recognition and then rights. These groups are the Aki, Hadzabe, Berabeg, and Maasai, two of which are hunter-gatherers and the other two are pastoralists. The concept of indigenousness, even though recognized by these groups, are not recognized by the government, the Republic of Tanzania. And in fact, they are discouraged, citing them as being tribalism, and a sort of wedge or wall in between Tanzania and the rest of Tanzania moving forward, progressing into a sort of more modern and Western way of living. Another point that my research yielded was that there's a concept of reality within these groups, wherein if incarcerated, they are robbed of a particular identity and reality that leads them to commit suicide or die within these cells. So if you have a pastoralist that's used to roaming these different lands around Tanzania, and then they're incarcerated, cited for, we'll get into what they're usually cited for, that concept of incarceration is not known throughout their communities, which leads them to either commit suicide or die in their cells. Another key point is that the Wildlife Department in tourism and conservation is the sort of aggressor toward these particular groups. There are many different conserved lands throughout Tanzania, of which, especially the Maasai being the larger group of 5,300,000, have occupied since time immemorial. And so during the colonial period, as conservation started to get a foothold, where people in power began to realize that these pristine areas needed to be protected, that is when the push of people outside of these lands began. And it's kept on going and going and going, especially in recent times, where the GDP is around 20% tourism for wildlife safaris coming in and out of Serengeti or Ngorongoro. That the Wildlife Department in tourism is how should I say, supporting the country with around 20% of the GDP, but also harming indigenous peoples, actual citizens of that country. I just wanted to point. The government uses a sort of what should I say, a circumnavigation of their own laws in order to inflict damage on these communities. So for example, poaching. A particular group, a particular person in an indigenous group could be cited for poaching because, say, a protected animal might come off of protected land and start grazing in different farms. And usually when this happens, that animal is killed in order to protect the livelihood of that person. Therein, the government can cite them for poaching and further move them away from those protected lands. Incarceration is interesting. The incarceration rates in Tanzania are almost impossible to find. But what I did find was punishment. So rather than arresting people that infringe upon the conservation land laws, instead of arresting them, they'll be punished in through different forms of displacement and eviction. And this means the burning of homes and sometimes brutal beatings, alleged rapes, and violence. during one of my interviews with Edward Parokwa, who is the executive director of Pingo's Forum over there in Tanzania, who's advocating for indigenous people's rights. His main contention about what one of the main issues is for indigenous people to become more recognized and obtain more rights is the level of access that they have, which is close to zero. And we're talking about access to sound media and access to justice in terms of lawyers that can navigate the intricacies of courts and the high courts in Tanzania and East Africa. But the media aspect is quite interesting. The information that's coming out of, say, northern Tanzania, where Loliondo, where around 70,000 Maasai stand to be evicted, and in Ngorongoro, where 80,000 Maasai stand to also be displaced. The information coming out even within Tanzania and internationally is false, not hitting the mark. And often the indigenous person is viewed as the criminal, as the aggressor, whereas this simply isn't the case. So the level of sound media is very, very low. It's hard to find throughout your bigger media outlets, say like the Washington Post or New York Times, for example, in America. So a better connection to a media outlet for indigenous people is needed so that this story, this voice can come to fruition, can come to a global level, so that advocacy and awareness can be raised. And that really is what the key points of what my research yielded. A bunch of cases. I was able to contact some people in Tanzania from the 5 months that I studied there when I was an undergrad, which was great. That gave me the concept of reality portion, also the access and the punishment rather than incarceration. The experience that I had researching it's very near and dear because of the time spent in Tanzania. So it was quite lovely to work with the country again and to reach out to old friends. But of course, studying Tanzania from New York City was very, very difficult. And thank goodness that I had these old connections. But the information is out there if the internet is combed over and over again. But usually it's not as in-depth or testimonial as I would like to see. And Edward Parokwa, his research yields many different cases where you can see a brutal beating or displacement. But he seems to be, at least in my experience right now, one of the only ones. And another observation, the last observation I'll make right here before I give you guys the floor to ask me any questions, is that there needs to be a more connection, boots on the ground that can collaborate with these communities and people like Edward Parokwa for a long period of time. I'm talking about several lifetimes to be handed off to people that want to take up this mantle. So, of course, that requires a monetary level that is difficult, unfortunately difficult to find. But boots on the ground and grassroots sort of interaction, if invited, if allowed into these communities, I think would be something which would yield better research. So thank you for the time given.
Yeah.
And
thank
if you
you.
have any questions about it, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lucas, and also for taking the time to join us, even if you're doing another research in Cuba. And I think it's good that you provided connections to all other issues that are linked to incarceration or criminalization of indigenous peoples, especially with how conservation in Tanzania is also linked to tourism, and how that is being, that supports the overall GDP, but then in expense of violation of indigenous people's rights. And also the role of media in instilling or further worsening how Indigenous peoples are seen, or with that, which how we can also like, it also opens up a discussion on how that can be reversed and make sure that the media is informed and present the issues of Indigenous peoples as they should be, and not to romanticize or further vilify the current situation, which worsens the issue of incarceration of Indigenous peoples in Tanzania. I believe you have, like, your connection is quite very poor, so I'd invite anyone who wants to raise a question now to Lucas. While we're waiting for that, it's good that you also highlighted the challenges of doing research, and still, as Mark has also mentioned, the importance of doing groundwork. And I know I can sense the frustration of not being able to be on the ground and gather firsthand data for this research, but I think it's still a good foundation to further research on incarceration or the violation of Indigenous people's rights in Tanzania in general. Sandra, Mark, and anyone from the participants would like to raise any questions to Lucas before he loses his internet connection and lose him?
Yeah, Lucas, it's Sandra. Thank you very much for that presentation. It was very interesting. What I find interesting, and people don't raise it, is the amount of people who actually do, if they're going to be incarceration or if they have been incarceration, that the suicide rates that is happening. And that's not a statistics when it comes to this, because we do know that people, you know, especially like you find a lot of Indigenous people, and I think that you really raised something really important, because you know that's the end of the road for a lot of people, you know, and to commit that, it's and we don't talk about that enough in our conversations, and you know, bringing that up is a good reminder of that. We do have this high rate of suicides, especially when it comes to land defenders or anything that's happening, or incarcerations of Indigenous people. So thank you. And I really found that your report was excellent as well, because you also spoke about the effects of children in this, and which is really important for people to know and understand. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you so much.
Thanks again, Lucas. Would you like to briefly discuss Canada, Sandra, or we can also move to Antine?
Yeah, if you move on, and then I'll come back and get an outline of the Canada report. That'll be great. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I'll just welcome Antine. Antine will be our discussant and provide us more of his view regarding doing research, in reflection also to what Lucas and Molly has already shared regarding their insights and experience in doing the research. So I'll just very briefly introduce Antine Sonde. Is a member of a semi-nomadic Fulani family in Burkina Faso. He holds a bachelor's degree in social and political history from the University of, forgive me if I mispronounce this, Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. And as a university student, he was part of those who created the association Derwan, which means cohesion, understanding, and union. Derwan hopes to promote education, culture, and human rights among nomadic pastoralists in Burkina Faso. He worked with Danish Refugee Council as a field assistant and program officer from 2014 to 2019, and he currently works as senior fellow in OHCHR's Indigenous Peoples Minority Section. Antine, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
All good.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to share my my experience about this topic. It's, as just said, I belong to a nomadic pastoralist community. It's called Fulani. Is a very large community in the Sahel region, and I have been really coming from that kind of community. Very small, is like in Burkina Faso we are like minority. That's, you know, because we had we don't have this access of many things in the country. People consider us like, we are not those who are belong to the urban cities like Ouagadougou or something like we are totally rural population. We are moving a lot. We don't have any connection linked to everything that is education, something like that. Then mostly everything that is linked to the situation of concerning the human rights or something like that really is something that we don't know. Then since some years, like 5 years, 7 years now, in my country, we are going through a situation that's called the counterterrorism. Like, in the Sahel region become a very, very tough thing for the Sahel region. Then the situation of human rights start becoming very difficult for the nomadic population. Mostly Mali and Burkina Faso, we are really we are the mostly concerned population of this part of the Sahel region, because we are really directly touched by the situation of the security matter, like the terrorism today. We are from the state, we are like they consider us as complice of terrorism. And from the terrorism, they consider us complice of the state. Really, we have this situation where we are between this kind of situation. And in January 2019, we had this mass killing of a lot of Fulani nomadic people in the central part of the north part of the country. And I was the first one who went to do some documentation to talk about that situation of the extrajudicial killing, But what's happened is a horrible thing, because as we are nomadic and people think that we don't have any right, since they could, the feeling of my community is that going to school or doing something that is really linked to the education or something like that is like we are still dealing with the colonization. We don't want anything. We want something that is our culture, that belongs to us. That way, when you go to school, for mostly they say that you lost your culture, you are not among. And that's why still now, till today, 80% of my community in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, anywhere in the Sahel region, 80% are not educated. Then they have been mostly used by the government officials. I will say that because they are not educated, they will pay things more, taxes more, or they will put in jail without knowing what's happening. And nowadays, because of this situation of the terrorism that I was talking about, we have a lot of extrajudicial killings. If you have a quick look of what's happening now in the Sahel region, we have a lot of extrajudicial killings. We have a lot of arbitrary detention. In 2017, 2018, till 2010, 2020, we were having like 4,000 arbitrary detention in the big prison of Burkina Faso, first, especially in the center region, because when they arrest them, because they are just look their face, they are Fulani, they've been arrested. Incarceration becomes something very common because we are belonging to indigenous people, belonging to Fulani community.
Mm-hmm.
We start documenting a lot about that, but the situation is continuing to become very difficult for us, because not only the army, we have been facing this arbitrary detention, we are facing too the situation of taking away our land. We are nomadic, but we have a space where we used to do our transhumance. What you call transhumance is the way, a practical way of moving place to place for finding some resources for the animals, like grasses and something like that. But these places are mostly people are looking to have these places, and we have been killed. Our animals is taken away. This is really what we are going through now in this region. Then, by myself, because of documenting of all this situation, I am here in Geneva. I'm not able to go back to my country. What I'm telling you is a situation that I am going through, because my governments, I talk about what they are doing to what the army is doing. What the army is, the situation that we are facing, the extrajudicial killing, the arbitrary detention. I talked to during the meeting at the UN. I'm not able to go home, because if I go home, I will be killed, or they will put me in jail and no one will find me where I will be. And mostly this is what situation the human rights defenders, especially those who are defending their land, defend their community, are facing now among the indigenous people community, especially sometimes in Africa, but we don't have information concerning that situation. That's the problem, because mostly the state don't want to let people know. They even, I can tell you, in 2019, in July 2019, they come out with a law in my country when they said anybody who talked about what the army is doing on the field will be put in jail for 10 years. Can you just imagine? It's like, yeah, we don't have this freedom to talk about the situation of the human rights violation, how people are being detained or something like that. We cannot talk. And indigenous people, the pastoral nomadic people are facing this situation. And I can just say, once the people are start running to go to Togo, Benin, just last month, 3 months ago, we had a lot of people were arrested on the border by the Togo army, because we were having a terrorism attack in the north of Togo, and they say that is a Fulani people who did that attack, and many were arrested on the border. We were obliged to see the desk officer of the OCHA in Togo, and they start intervening. They start doing something, then they free some of them, but some of them still there, and the government took over like 6,000 of the cattle. 6,000. I'm saying 6,000. By the time we were talking, they start selling like 500 were already sold.
Yeah.
Because that's really the situation that the Fulani community is going through in this Sahel region now. They don't, if they go in another country, they don't consider them like refugees, asylum seekers. They consider them like terrorists. Mostly what happened. They are running away from the situation that they have been killed. They don't have access to their land, and if they go somewhere, they will consider them like terrorists, and they took over their animals, something like that. In Benin, is now on the open. Just this week, they opened the borders. The border was closed for all the herders who are coming from Burkina Faso, from Niger, from Mali. Can you just imagine how can we survive in that situation?
Yeah.
This is really the situation we are going through in this part of the Sahel region, facing the situation of the security and facing the situation of the climate changes. And now we don't have this right to defend ourselves. Once you raise your voice, you will be put in jail. This is a matter. Yeah.
Thank
if you have any question or concern, that is yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Auntie, for sharing your thoughts and also your personal experience. And of course, we are in solidarity of the work that you do and the struggle that your family and the indigenous communities in Burkina Faso are currently going through. And we'd be very much interested if you said you've done documentation on the violations, even beyond the issue of incarceration of Indigenous peoples. We'd be, if that's something that you can share with us, we'd be very much interested to also have a look at it and see how that can be part of what IPRI is working on, at least in studying incarceration of Indigenous peoples. We'd be very, very grateful if you could share that with us. And also for highlighting how, because it's the same with other countries, how the law is being used by the government to actually control Indigenous peoples, human rights defenders and activists, and how the tagging them as terrorists to justify their incarceration or for killing and killing for that matter. I hope you keep yourself safe and your family.
Thank you.
If there are any questions for Antine, and hopefully if while others are still formulating their question, you can still stay and join us until the very end. Thanks again, Antine. Now, Sandra, would you like to present very briefly Canada, because we don't have Khadija?
Yeah, I'll just do quickly the one on Indonesia, actually, if that's okay, because I do have a bit of information on that.
All right, sure.
And the lady who was presenting that, as you know, over in America, they're on leave. I'd just like to say that one of the things when they were researching through Indonesia, which people do not understand, and they think they don't understand the issues that is happening currently in Indonesia. Indonesia is one of the highest rates where you can get of killings actually on land defenders, and because of the issue when it comes to land and West Papua, we have a high rate of land defenders being killed over in Indonesia. The problem is that it's not really supported internationally. People are not aware of what's going on over there. And the sad part is that we have, I have spoken to someone who was wanting to come to the UN on a trip, and what happened is that when you go to Indonesia, when you're in Indonesia and you want to go, and in particularly West Papua, where we're talking about, is that part of West Papua, they are it's very hard for them to get visas, and I found that during the research for the student who was doing it, there's not a lot of statistics. And I just want to really point out, in all of this research, it was very difficult to find statistics on incarcerations and police brutality on land defenders and Indigenous peoples in this world. And that's why I think, you know, by starting off and doing these reports and having this conversation with IPRI, that's how we can build on it, because we need to really have solid data. We need to have solid evidence to show the world, especially what is happening to the incarcerations and the injustice system and the legal system when it comes to Indigenous peoples in the world. And not just that, there's also a lot of legislations and a lot of land treaties that limit Indigenous peoples to having their rights. And when Indigenous people are protesting against this is when they are being charged, they're incarcerated, people go missing, people are murdered. Yet we, as Indigenous people, our laws and rights are to be here, to be the stewardships to the world, to look after the earth and to continue to maintain it. But to the colonised world and the legal system, we're seen as criminals. And this is why statistics are hard, because the justice system doesn't always record everything. The police are not always writing everything down, reporting rights, reporting what is who they're arresting. When it comes to our land defenders in particular, they go missing. But the problem is, like I said, we are being charged on a criminal offence in this world when us as Indigenous people are really looking after the world, not just for us, but for everybody, and to maintain for the next 7 generations. It's a really concern of the behaviour of how the colonial laws actually see us and how they're exerting so much brutality and injustice on Indigenous peoples. So yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sandra, and for willingly presenting on behalf of Khadija. Thank you very much for that. I'll just read out a question for Antine that's been sent in the chat. The indigenous language and translation in other languages is a key question in the increase of mass incarceration. How does the legal system deal with the question in different contexts? Antine, would you like to? I think the question is, how does language, is this, tell me if I'm right, Adrian, do you mean how a national language is usually different to the language of indigenous peoples affect the legal system or the access to justice of indigenous peoples? Is that what you're going for? We could provide you the mic very briefly.
Okay.
Yeah, Antine.
I maybe not. Yeah, probably you have to understand the question is mostly, we are colonized by French, by France, then our language is the official language is France. Then everything that is written, that is official, is in France. Then my community, the Fulani, we speak Fulfulde, is a very is normally the second language of the master after the another one called More. This is the largest one. But something, as I said, my community is mostly we don't have the percentage of those who are able to went to school are very few, very few. Then we don't have really documents that have been translated in my languages and that will be accessible to them. And mostly we are living in a very far area where we cannot, sometimes it's not easy for the government officers to reach us. Sometimes we are in the bushes where people don't want to go there. Then we don't have access, for example, the TV, or don't have access even to a network like an project today. We are really in the traditional way of life. This is what we are doing. Then talking about language in the system of having access to justice is a difficult situation for us. Mostly people will be put in jail for years. They don't know what to do. The family don't know what kind of process they have to take. And sometimes even they will be abused. Mostly they will ask them to pay for something like for millions of thousands francs CFA for nothing. Mostly we have this situation because people, they don't know, they don't have anything written in their language. How can we understand? They don't have this access to justice in their language. And some of the cases have possibility to give them interpreter, but mostly interpreter cannot do something like they can translate what they want. They don't translate sometimes what the person said. Mostly what happened in justice court. And what I'm just saying, really we are working as a small group of indigenous people. We are working on how to help. That way, the first time I went to university, I found some students there that are belonging to my ethnic group. I told them, let's create something. We create this organization we call Deuron, and we have started working on education because this is the main matter. If you want our community to have access to the right to justice, everything, they need to go to school. They need to be educated. They need to understand how life is working now, because being far, it will be difficult for them to understand how life is working. That's I don't know if I understand his question.
Thank you. I think, thank you very much for that, Antine. Mark, do you have any questions?
Well, I can add something in relation to the Guatemala case that relates to Adrian's question and echoes what Antine also said about Burkina Faso, which is that in Guatemala, it's constitutionally mandated that indigenous defendants in court cases get proper translation, but it just doesn't happen in reality, which won't surprise anyone. And also it's notable in Guatemala, I think the population, the indigenous population, is estimated at 50%, but it also won't surprise you that it's undercounted. And most people believe that the indigenous population is actually the majority in Guatemala, and yet they don't receive proper translation services in legal cases. So it definitely, as Adriana asked, it definitely contributes to the criminalization and mass incarceration of the indigenous population in Guatemala.
Mm. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that addition, Mark. We're almost at the end of our side event, but I just want to call on Felipe Kamarowski, because he shared a study that he did regarding mischaracterization of indigenous peoples incarcerated in Brazil. Would you like to briefly share that before I call on John to wrap up the whole thing? Would you like to speak on that? I think we can let you, allow you to use the mic. Isn't that right, Ivan? All right, right. Of course. Yeah, I'm sorry. We don't have a, if you speak Portuguese, we don't have a translator of Portuguese. But if you speak Spanish, we have a Spanish translator. But it's no pressure. Again, I think I won't be able to, or we won't be able to go through your study, but thank you very much for sharing that. I think that's going to be useful for the work that we do. And if there are no other questions, but I just want to point out, thank you very much for Jose Godinho for joining us and sending his thoughts, and also to Chanchana Chakma for mentioning the issues that are happening in Bangladesh. I think now I can call on Joan. I'll just briefly introduce John. John is one of more prominent indigenous activists from Cordillera in the Philippines, having more than 20 years of working on indigenous issues from grassroots to the international level. She was awarded the Champions of the Earth for Lifetime Achievement by the UN Environment in September 2018, and she's currently IPRI's Global Director. John, please, you have the floor.
Thanks, Joyce. After listening to this very rich and very insightful and informative presentation of our speakers, it's very clear that the issue of incarceration is a very, very serious problem that needs concerted effort, no? Especially since it's very much tied to existing systems of racism and discrimination, as well as the lack of access to justice. Many of our speakers also highlighted the issue of human rights defenders that are also victimized. And I, like, for example, those that has been raised in the case of Burkina Faso, where it's also leading to killings and not just detention. And this again shows the seriousness of the prevailing systemic violations of the rights of indigenous peoples. So in this regard, IPRI has made a commitment to look into this issue of incarceration, and that is also the reason why we partnered with New School, and thanks a lot to all these volunteer and committed students who did this research, which demonstrated the urgent need to address this problem. So for IPRI moving forward, it's really important for us to develop a more targeted advocacy plan, particularly addressing the needs for access to justice, which is one of the priority issues of IPRI, and also to mobilize and facilitate legal support to the victims, and also to continue our documentation and research, so to keep this issue visible and raise this to proper forum where attention and action is needed. So it should, of course, the UN mechanism, the UN mechanisms is part of the targets for advocacy, but also not only at the global level, but we need to look at what can be done also at the national level in collaboration already with existing organizations of indigenous peoples, as well as support groups like groups of lawyers or those providing legal services. So it's I'm really, how do you say, really touched with the depth of the findings of the research clearly shows that we really need to act on this issue. So I hope the organizations dealing with human rights of indigenous peoples will also partner with us in working in addressing this serious concern of incarceration and the lack of justice. So just to conclude, I want to first express our appreciation to New School for this very productive and fruitful collaboration, and we look forward to our continuing collaboration. We wish to extend our appreciation to the work and commitment by all those involved. We have Mark, we have Molly, we have Lucas, and we have also the other students with us. And we again look forward to continuing our collaboration with you. I would also like to thank our other speakers, as well as my colleagues and also the interpreters. And we hope that IPRI will be able to, together with the New School, come out with a publication on the result of the research, so that we bring more awareness and attention to this very, very serious problem of indigenous peoples around the world. Thank you again, and thank you to everyone. I wish you a good day. So back to you, Joyce.
Thank you very much, Joanne. So I think, again, it's also to thank everyone who has joined us and stayed with us until the very end. Yes, and feel free to share other, you have our email addresses, share other studies that you think related or be very useful to the work that we do, or to the, as John has mentioned, to our plans of doing a publication on incarceration of indigenous peoples. Thanks, everyone. Bye. Good night from this side of the world.